A city finds the bodies. Cleveland, Ohio, 1935. The city was already struggling long before the bodies appeared. Factories stood half-silent along the Cuyahoga River, their smokestacks coughing out less promise than they once had. Men lined up every morning hoping for work that rarely came. Families crowded into small homes, sharing heat, food, and fear. The Great Depression had hollowed the city from the inside out, leaving behind desperation and invisible people. Men and women who could disappear without anyone noticing. That was the world the killer understood, and it was the world that allowed him to operate unseen. The first body did not shock Cleveland the way it should have. It was found near Kingsbury Run, a sprawling ravine that cut through the industrial heart of the city. A place where the poor lived in makeshift shacks, where transients slept under bridges, and where police rarely lingered unless forced to. When remains were discovered there, they were often written off as accidents, suicides, or the inevitable result of poverty. But this body was different. It was headless. First, newspapers described it cautiously. Torso, severed cleanly at the neck. No identifying features. No clothing. No name. Police attempted to downplay it. One body, they said, did not make a pattern. One body did not mean a killer. They were wrong. Because what they were seeing was not the beginning. It was merely the first discovery. The victim would later be referred to as John Doe, a name that stripped him of identity just as completely as his killer had. Medical examiners determined the body had been decapitated while still alive or shortly after death. The cuts were precise, deliberate, not the frantic violence of rage, but the controlled work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Whoever had done this was calm, methodical, experienced, and the head was never found. As weeks passed, Cleveland tried to forget. The newspapers moved on. The city needed hope, not fear. But the ravine kept its secrets, and soon it would give up. Another. In September 1935, a second torso was found, this time more decomposed. Again, no head. Again, no way to identify the victim. But now there was something else. The pattern was undeniable. Both bodies had been dismembered in a similar manner. The cuts were clean, surgical. Bones were not hacked apart, they were separated at joints. This was not the work of a butcher in a slaughterhouse frenzy. It was the work of someone who understood anatomy, someone who had practiced. The press finally gave the killer a name, the Cleveland Torso Murderer. Others called him something darker, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Fear spread quickly through the city's poorest neighborhoods. People whispered at night. Men avoided sleeping alone. Women disappeared from public spaces after sunset. But the city's elite, politicians, professionals, and those with power, felt distant from the threat. The victims were nameless. That made them easy to ignore. By 1936, the bodies began appearing with disturbing regularity. Some were found near the river. Others were left in plain sight, as if daring police to understand. In one case, the body of a woman was discovered, the first confirmed female victim. Her head was found nearby, but her face was unrecognizable, soaked in chemicals that destroyed any chance of identification. The killer was escalating, not just in frequency, but in confidence that he was no longer hiding his work deep in the ravine. He was placing bodies where they would be seen. The message was clear: you still haven't caught me. Police departments across the country were watching Cleveland closely. Serial killers were not yet understood in the way they are today. The idea of a single individual murdering strangers repeatedly, for reasons unknown, was still difficult for many to accept. But Cleveland had no choice. By the time the sixth victim was found, the city was gripped by panic. Parents warned children not to wander. Newspapers printed maps showing where bodies had been discovered. And behind closed doors, city officials faced an uncomfortable truth. They were losing control. In desperation, Cleveland turned to its most famous protector, Eliot Ness. Known nationally for taking down Al Capone, Ness was appointed director of public safety. He arrived with a reputation for discipline, intelligence, and moral certainty. If anyone could stop the Mad Butcher, it was him, or so they hoped. Ness reorganized the police force, fired corrupt officers, and personally reviewed evidence. He walked the crime scenes. He studied photographs. He spoke to witnesses no one else bothered to question. And still, the killings continued. One body was found mere blocks from Ness's office. It was as if the killer wanted him to know. This was not a game of chance. This was a contest of minds. By 1938, at least 12 victims had been confirmed. Some estimates suggest there were many more, bodies never found, never counted, never given even the dignity of a number. Most were never identified. They lived on the margins. And they died there. The Cleveland torso murders would eventually stop as suddenly as they began. No arrest would ever be made. No trial would ever reveal the truth. Files would be lost, destroyed, or sealed. Suspects would die without confession. The killer would vanish. But the fear he created never fully left, because Cleveland learned something terrifying during those years. You do not need to know someone to be hunted by them, and sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who understand society better than society understands them. The victims without names. The dead did not arrive in Cleveland as strangers. They became strangers after they were found, before the newspapers reduced them to numbers and nicknames, before police reports erased their histories with phrases like unidentified male or unknown transient. These people had lives. They had routines. They had reasons for being where they were. Some had families. Some had none. Many had simply slipped through the cracks of a city overwhelmed by economic collapse. That was not an accident. It was the foundation of the killer's strategy. The Cleveland torso murderer did not hunt randomly. He selected people who could vanish quietly, those whose absence would not immediately trigger alarms, investigations, or headlines. In the 1930s, America did not have national missing persons databases. Fingerprinting existed, but it was inconsistently applied. Dental records were rare among the poor. Photographs were uncommon. Identification depended on someone noticing you were gone. Most of the victims had no one left to notice. Kingsbury Run was more than a ravine. It was a shadow city within Cleveland, a maze of shantytowns built from scrap wood, tar paper, and discarded metal. Thousands lived there illegally, beyond the reach of social services and often beyond the patience of law enforcement. It was loud during the day, dangerous at night, and invisible to those who did not want to see it. This was where the killer found his victims. Men drifting from job to job, women escaping violence or poverty, alcoholics, migrant workers, people whose identities were already unstable, whose paper trails barely existed. When police found the bodies, they attempted identification using the limited tools available. Height, estimated age, bone structure, scars. But without heads, in many cases, even basic facial recognition was impossible. The killer had removed the most obvious marker of identity with chilling consistency. That he understood something fundamental. A body without a face is not just harder to identify. It is easier to forget. John Doe I, John Doe II, Jane Doe I, these were not names. They were placeholders, administrative conveniences that allowed case files to be stacked, archived, and eventually ignored. But behind each of them was a human story that never reached the public. Take one of the earliest victims, discovered in August 1935. The torso was found near the East 49th Street Bridge. The legs were missing. The head was gone. Medical examiners estimated the victim was male, between 40 and 60 years old. He had been dead for several weeks. The cuts were clean, the dismemberment precise. But there was something else. The skin showed signs of chemical treatment. The killer had used lime or another corrosive substance, possibly to remove fingerprints or destroy distinguishing marks. This was not improvisation. This was forethought. Another victim, found months later, displayed similar characteristics. The body had been carefully washed. No blood pooled at the scene, suggesting the killing occurred elsewhere. The murderer transported the remains after death or after dismemberment. Transport requires planning. It requires strength. It requires privacy. Police began to realize that the killer did not live in Kingsbury Run. He used it. The murders happened somewhere else, indoors, controlled, concealed. A basement, a workshop, a laboratory, somewhere he could take his time. The victims themselves offered little resistance to this conclusion. Many showed no defensive wounds, no broken bones from struggle. This suggested they either trusted the killer or were incapacitated before death. Trust is a weapon. Some investigators theorized that the killer offered alcohol, shelter, or work. In an era where survival often depended on informal agreements, such offers were common. A man with steady hands and calm speech would not seem threatening. A man who appeared educated, perhaps even helpful, would be welcomed, especially by those who had nothing. One female victim, found in 1936, was later partially identified through fragments of clothing and physical characteristics. She was believed to be in her 20s, possibly a waitress or domestic worker. Her head was eventually recovered, but her face had been destroyed by chemicals, rendering recognition impossible. The killer had made a choice. He allowed the head to be found, but ensured it could not speak. That decision puzzled investigators. Why leave the head at all? Some believed it was a mistake. Others believed it was a message. Control was the key theme. The killer controlled where bodies were placed, what parts were found, what information survived. He dictated the narrative long before newspapers ever wrote a word. In several cases, limbs were discovered miles apart from torsos. This complicated timelines, confused jurisdictions, and delayed investigations. Police departments argued over responsibility. Evidence was lost in transit. Chain of custody procedures were primitive at best. The killer exploited this chaos. Even when police suspected they were dealing with a serial murderer, they struggled to prove it conclusively. Each body was technically a separate case. Without names, connections were theoretical. Patterns were argued, not accepted. This bureaucratic fragmentation was lethal, and the killer knew it. In 1937, a torso was discovered floating in the Cuyahoga River. It had been wrapped in cloth, weighted down, and submerged deliberately. This was a departure from previous disposal methods, suggesting experimentation or adaptation. The killer was learning. So were the police, but more slowly, public pressure mounted. Newspapers demanded answers. Citizens demanded safety. But the victim's anonymity worked against justice. It was difficult to rally sympathy for people no one could name. This imbalance disturbed some within the police force. A few detectives began documenting the victims as individuals rather than evidence. They reconstructed probable life histories based on scars, dental anomalies, healed fractures. They tried to imagine who these people had been. But imagination does not replace identity. Without families to claim bodies, many victims were buried in unmarked graves. Their case files grew thin, leads dried up, and as time passed, urgency faded. The killer remained free. One of the most haunting aspects of the Cleveland torso murders is how many victims may never have been found at all. Kingsbury Run was vast, the river unpredictable, industrial waste sites common. It is entirely possible that the known victims represent only a fraction of the total. The killer's restraint suggests longevity. This was not someone driven by uncontrollable impulse. This was someone who planned, waited, selected. Someone capable of stopping and starting at will. And that raises a disturbing possibility. Some victims may have survived encounters. They may have escaped, changed cities, or never spoken of what happened. Fear has a way of silencing people. especially those already marginalized. Police interviewed dozens of transients, but few could offer reliable testimony. Many were intoxicated. Others feared arrest. Some simply did not trust authority. In the 1930s, that mistrust was often justified. The killer moved freely among them. He blended in. This anonymity worked both ways. Just as victims were hard to identify, so was the murderer. He left no signatures beyond the bodies themselves. No letters. No confessions. No obvious trophies. He did not crave attention. He craved control. By stripping victims of names, faces, and histories, he asserted dominance not just over individuals, but over the narrative itself. He decided who mattered and who did not. And for years, the system agreed with him. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of the Cleveland torso murders. The killer succeeded not only because of his skill, but because society allowed certain people to disappear. And as long as that remained true, he did not need to hide. He only needed to wait. Patterns in the dismemberment. At first glance, the bodies told a simple story. Someone was cutting them apart. But simplicity was an illusion. The more investigators studied the remains, the clearer it became that the Cleveland torso murderer was not acting blindly, emotionally, or impulsively. The dismemberment was not random. It followed rules. It followed knowledge. And knowledge leaves patterns. The cuts were clean. That fact alone separated this killer from countless others. Bones were not shattered or hacked through. Limbs were separated at joints. Vertebrae were divided with precision. Even when decomposition made examination difficult, medical examiners could still see intent in the way the bodies had been reduced. This was not rage. This was process. In many cases, the decapitation appeared to have occurred either immediately before death or shortly after. There was little evidence of prolonged struggle. No chaotic trauma. No broken defensive bones. This suggested that the victims were either incapacitated, restrained, or compliant. Compliance is the most disturbing option, because it implies trust. The killer did not need brute force. He did not overpower his victims in public. He brought them somewhere private, somewhere controlled, and they went willingly or at least without panic. That immediately narrowed the type of person investigators were looking for. This was someone who could speak calmly, someone who could appear non-threatening, someone who inspired enough confidence to make a vulnerable person follow him indoors. The dismemberment itself revealed something else. The killer understood anatomy, not at the level of a surgeon performing complex operations, but at a level well beyond that of an ordinary person. He knew where joints separated naturally. He knew how to remove limbs efficiently. He knew how to work with the body rather than against it. Medical examiners debated the extent of his training. Some believed he was a butcher. Others suspected a medical background. A few suggested he might be a mortician, anatomist, or even a medical student who had failed or dropped out. Each theory had merit, but none fit perfectly. A butcher, for example, would be skilled at dismembering animals, but human anatomy differs in subtle but important ways. A surgeon would have the knowledge, but surgeons typically leave behind different cut patterns, shaped by surgical tools rather than brute instruments. The Cleveland killer seemed to exist in between, a competent but not clinical, precise but not elegant. This suggested practical experience rather than formal mastery. Another disturbing detail emerged when examiners compared cases across time. The killer was improving. Early victims showed minor irregularities, hesitations, uneven edges, signs that the work took longer. Later victims were processed faster, more efficiently, less tissue damage, cleaner separations. This was not escalation in violence. It was escalation in skill, which meant the killer was learning from each murder. The disposal methods also evolved. At first, bodies were hidden deep within Kingsbury Run. Later, they were placed closer to public areas. One victim was found near a police training school. Another was left within sight of major roads. The killer was adjusting risk. He was confident, but not reckless. One of the most puzzling patterns involved the removal or partial destruction of heads. In most cases, heads were never recovered. In a few, they were found but rendered useless for identification. This was not symbolic. It was functional. The head contains the face. The face carries identity. Teeth carry records. Facial bones carry unique structure. By removing or destroying the head, the killer erased the victim twice, physically and administratively. This was not sadism. It was strategy. Some victims also showed signs of chemical exposure. Lime, acid, or similar substances were used to damage skin and tissue. In some cases, fingerprints were compromised. In others, facial features were deliberately altered. The killer knew exactly what police relied on, and he took it away. Investigators began to suspect that the murderer followed news coverage closely. He adjusted his methods in response to public discussion. When newspapers mentioned fingerprinting, fingerprints disappeared. When identification techniques improved, bodies became more incomplete. This implied awareness, possibly obsession. He was not killing in isolation. He was killing within a conversation. Police attempted to reconstruct the killer's workspace. Wherever the murders occurred, it had to meet certain conditions. It needed privacy. It needed time. It needed tools. And it needed a way to clean thoroughly. Blood was rarely found at disposal sites. That meant the killing and dismemberment happened elsewhere. An indoor location. Likely one the killer had legal access to. A basement, a workshop, a storage facility, possibly even a medical or industrial space. Somewhere noise would not attract attention. Somewhere smells could be explained or concealed. This ruled out many suspects and implicated others. Doctors, dentists, veterinarians, medical students, industrial workers, men with technical training and private access to enclosed spaces. But Cleveland in the 1930s was full of such men, and most were innocent. The killer's restraint also suggested emotional control. There were no unnecessary mutilations, no ritualistic carvings, no messages carved into flesh, no attempts to display bodies theatrically. This was not performance. This was function, which raised a terrifying question. If the murders were not driven by emotion, then what drove them? Some investigators believe the killer was motivated by experimentation, testing methods, refining techniques. Others suspected a desire for domination rather than pleasure. Control over life, control over death, control over narrative. The way the bodies were presented supports the latter. The killer did not rush. He did not panic. He chose when to kill and when to stop. He chose where to place remains. He chose what police could see. And when police misunderstood him, he corrected them by changing his methods. This adaptability is rare. It is not the hallmark of madness. It is the hallmark of intelligence. Yet intelligence alone does not explain the absence of certain behaviors. The killer did not taunt police directly. He did not write letters. He did not claim credit. He did not seek recognition. This suggests he was not driven by ego, at least not in a traditional sense. His satisfaction may have come from remaining unseen, from outthinking those searching for him, from proving that even with attention, resources, and pressure, he could continue unchallenged. As the pattern became clearer, investigators faced a painful realization. They were not chasing chaos. They were chasing order. And order is harder to disrupt than madness, because madness burns itself out. Order adapts. By the late 1930s, the killer's methods had reached a level of consistency that made profiling possible, at least in theory. But profiling as a discipline barely existed. Psychological frameworks were crude. Many investigators still believed criminals could be understood only through background and opportunity, not mindset. This blind spot cost them. Because the Cleveland torso murderer was not defined by who he was on paper, he was defined by how he thought. And how he thought allowed him to disappear. Not into darkness, but into normal life. Eliot Ness versus the Mad Butcher. By the time Eliot Ness took control of public safety in Cleveland, the city was already exhausted. The murders had become a shadow that followed every newspaper headline, every city council meeting, every whispered conversation in public spaces. People did not just fear the killer, they feared the idea that no one could stop him. Ness was supposed to change that. Nationally, he was a symbol of order. The man who had helped bring down Al Capone. The incorruptible lawman. The figure who proved that discipline and intelligence could triumph over criminal networks. Cleveland needed that myth. Because the reality on the ground was far darker. When Ness arrived, he found a police force fractured by politics, corruption, and incompetence. Evidence handling was inconsistent. Communication between departments was poor. Leads were ignored or lost. Some officers were more concerned with protecting reputations than solving crimes. Ness moved quickly. He reorganized the department, fired officers suspected of corruption, and centralized investigative authority. For the first time, the torso murders were treated as a single, continuous case rather than isolated incidents. This was progress. But it was not enough. Ness personally reviewed photographs of the bodies. He studied autopsy reports. He walked through Kingsbury Run, seeing the environment that had allowed the killer to operate undetected for so long. He spoke with coroners, detectives, and patrol officers, and what he saw disturbed him. The killer was not hiding in shadows, he was hiding in plain sight. Ness believed the murderer lived in Cleveland, worked there, and moved through the city unnoticed. He was not a drifter. He was not transient. He had stability, access, routine. This contradicted many early theories. Under Ness's direction, police compiled a list of suspects that included doctors, surgeons, medical students, butchers, and anyone with anatomical knowledge and private workspaces. Hundreds were questioned. Alibis were checked. Records were examined. Nothing stuck. Public pressure intensified. Newspapers began criticizing Ness openly. How could the man who defeated Capone fail to stop a lone killer? Editorials questioned his competence. Political rivals saw opportunity. The killer did not slow down. In 1938, 2 bodies were discovered within sight of key city landmarks. One was found near the Cleveland Memorial Shoreway, another near a major road. These were not hidden remains. They were statements. Ness took them personally. He believed the killer was watching him. Reading newspapers, following the investigation, adjusting behavior accordingly. This belief changed Ness's approach. He stopped waiting for evidence to come to him. He went to the killer's hunting ground. In one of the most controversial actions of his career, Ness ordered a large-scale raid on Kingsbury Run. Shantytowns were cleared. Makeshift homes were burned. Hundreds of transients were arrested or forced to relocate. Officially, the goal was public safety. Unofficially, it was pressure. Ness believed the killer relied on the anonymity of the run. Remove that environment, and the murderer would either stop or make a mistake. For a time, it appeared to work. No new bodies were discovered immediately after the raid. But the cost was immense. Families lost what little shelter they had. Innocent people were displaced. Civil rights advocates criticized the operation. Some accused Ness of punishing victims rather than protecting them. The killer, meanwhile, remained silent. No confession, no slip, no capture. Behind the scenes, investigators were focusing on a small number of serious suspects. One of them stood out above the rest, a man named Frank Dolezal. Dolezal was a Cleveland resident with a criminal record, unstable behavior, and connections to Kingsbury Run. He was known to associate with some of the victims. Under intense interrogation, he allegedly confessed to killing at least 2 people. The confession was a breakthrough. Or so it seemed. Almost immediately, inconsistencies emerged. The details did not match forensic evidence. Dolezal's account of dismemberment was vague and confused. Medical examiners doubted he had the knowledge or physical ability to carry out the crimes. Then Dolezal recanted. Soon after, he was found dead in his jail cell. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious. Multiple broken ribs, a method that seemed physically improbable. Whispers spread quickly through Cleveland. Had police forced a confession? Had they silenced a scapegoat? Or had they lost control entirely? Ness denied wrongdoing, but the damage was done. The public began to question whether the investigation was collapsing under its own weight. The murders stopped not long after. This created a new mystery. Why? Had Ness succeeded? Had the killer been frightened into stopping? Had he died, moved away, or simply chosen to end his campaign? No one knew. What was clear was that Ness had not caught him. The case remained open, unresolved, and increasingly uncomfortable for city officials. Files were sealed. Evidence was misplaced. Some documents were destroyed, intentionally or otherwise. The legend of Eliot Ness survived. The truth did not. In later years, Ness would privately admit that the Torso murders haunted him more than any other case. He had faced organized crime, corruption, and violence, and won. But against a single, methodical killer, he had failed. And that failure revealed something unsettling. The tools that work against criminal empires do not always work against solitary predators. Because organizations leave trails, individuals erase them. The Cleveland Torso murderer did not defeat Eliot Ness through force. He defeated him through patience. By understanding the system better than the system understood him. And by knowing exactly when to disappear, prime suspects and destroyed evidence. As public confidence eroded and the murders ceased, the Cleveland Torso case did not move closer to resolution. It moved into silence. Officially, the investigation remained open. Unofficially, it began to dissolve, slowly, deliberately, and almost invisibly. Files were transferred, reclassified, misplaced. Evidence that once seemed critical was no longer available. Witness statements disappeared. Physical materials degraded or were destroyed. This did not happen all at once. It happened piece by piece. And that process may be the most important clue of all. From the beginning, investigators knew the killer was unlikely to be a transient. The level of planning, anatomical knowledge, and access required pointed toward someone with education, stability, and privacy. As the case progressed, attention narrowed to a small group of men whose backgrounds matched these requirements. Some were questioned quietly. Others were protected. The most prominent suspect, aside from Frank Dolezal, was a man whose name appeared repeatedly in internal discussions but rarely in public statements. A respected Cleveland physician. Highly educated. Socially connected. Known for unusual behavior. Known, according to some accounts, to struggle with mental instability. And critically, known to have access to medical facilities, chemicals, and private workspaces. This man was never charged. In fact, his name was deliberately omitted from many official documents. Why? Part of the answer lies in the culture of the time. In the 1930s, accusing a prominent professional of serial murder without overwhelming evidence was unthinkable. Doctors were pillars of society. To suggest that one of them might be dismembering people in secret would not only destroy a career, it would destabilize public trust in institutions already under strain. Eliot Ness reportedly believed this man was responsible. But belief was not proof. The evidence against the doctor was circumstantial. Witnesses described strange behavior. Neighbors reported odd hours and unusual smells. Colleagues spoke quietly of instability. But no physical evidence tied him directly to the bodies. And then there was the fire. In one of the most controversial incidents connected to the case, a medical facility linked to the suspect burned down under suspicious circumstances. Official explanations cited accident. Unofficial accounts suggested something else. Evidence may have been destroyed. If so, it was destroyed at the worst possible time. Shortly after, the suspect was committed to a mental institution. He would spend the rest of his life there. He was never tried, never publicly accused, never officially named. The case moved on. Or rather, it didn't. Other suspects existed, but none carried the same weight. Some were dismissed quickly. Others were never fully investigated. With no new murders, political pressure eased. The city wanted closure, not controversy. That desire shaped the investigation's final phase. Files were sealed. Evidence was cataloged and archived. Then portions were lost. In later decades, researchers attempting to review the case encountered gaps. Missing photographs, incomplete autopsy reports, redacted names. Some materials were destroyed during routine record purges. Others vanished without explanation. This loss is not neutral. It shapes what can be known and what cannot. The destruction of evidence may not have been malicious in the traditional sense. It may have been bureaucratic, convenient, quiet, but the effect was the same. The truth became unreachable. Frank Dolezal's death further complicated matters. His alleged confession had briefly offered a resolution, one that authorities seemed eager to accept. When that resolution collapsed, the vacuum it left was never filled. Better no answer than the wrong one. Especially if the right answer threatened powerful interests. Modern criminologists examining the case are often struck by how quickly investigative momentum vanished once the killing stopped. This is not typical behavior. Most serial cases intensify after a cessation, driven by urgency to capture a killer before he returns. Cleveland did the opposite. It closed ranks. The implication is uncomfortable. Either the city believed the killer was no longer a threat, or it believed something else. Perhaps it believed the killer was already contained. Not imprisoned, contained, institutionalized. Silenced. Or protected by the simple passage of time. There is no document that confirms this, but the absence of documentation is itself telling. Cases that remain unsolved typically generate questions. This one generated erasure. Even Eliot Ness, years later, refused to speak openly about certain suspects. In private, he expressed regret. In public, he maintained ambiguity. This duality suggests constraint, not ignorance. The Cleveland torso murderer was not defeated in a courtroom. He was absorbed into obscurity. And obscurity can be intentional. The legacy of this failure extends beyond the murders themselves. It reveals how systems respond when truth threatens stability. How justice can be deprioritized in favor of order. How some crimes are considered too disruptive to solve publicly. And how some killers escape not through brilliance, but through alignment with institutional fear. The evidence did not disappear because it was irrelevant. It disappeared because it was dangerous. Dangerous to reputations. Dangerous to careers. Dangerous to the narrative Cleveland needed to believe. That the monster was gone. And that it had never been one of them. The killer who vanished. Serial killers rarely stop. That simple truth has shaped decades of criminal psychology. Patterns persist. Compulsions escalate. When murders cease abruptly, it usually means one of three things. The killer is dead, incarcerated, or physically unable to continue. The Cleveland torso murderer did not fit neatly into any of these explanations. The killings ended in 1938. Not with an arrest. Not with a trial. Not with a confession. They simply stopped. At first, the city welcomed the silence. No new bodies. No headlines. No fear spreading through the streets. But for investigators, the absence of violence created a different kind of anxiety. What had changed? One possibility was death. The killer may have died unexpectedly. From illness, accident, or suicide. The late 1930s were not gentle years. Medical care was limited. Records were inconsistent. A sudden death could easily go unnoticed, especially if the individual lived alone. But this explanation raised questions. If the killer had died, Why had there been no indication of decline beforehand? No escalación, no desesperación. The murders did not grow frantic. They remained controlled until the end. Another possibility was incarceration for an unrelated crime. The killer could have been arrested for something minor and quietly removed from society. This theory appealed to investigators because it required no conspiracy, no cover-up. But it, too, lacked evidence. No arrest records aligned convincingly with the timeline. No suspect disappeared in a way that matched the cessation. And no prison inmate ever confessed credibly. The third explanation, physical or psychological incapacity, gained more traction. If the killer had been institutionalized, injured, or otherwise rendered unable to continue, the murders would stop without public acknowledgement. Mental health commitments in the 1930s were often private, poorly documented, and permanent. This theory aligned uncomfortably well with the known suspects. Point 1 in particular, a man whose behavior had alarmed colleagues, a man whose access and skills matched the crimes, a man who was removed from public life shortly after the murders ended. The timing was precise. But again, no proof, and proof matters. Another angle focused on geography. The killer may have moved. Cleveland was a transit hub. Railways connected it to dozens of cities. A man could vanish simply by boarding a train. If this was the case, the question became even more disturbing. Did the murders continue somewhere else? Some researchers have searched for similar unsolved cases in other cities. A few bear superficial resemblance, dismembered bodies, unidentified victims, but none form a convincing continuation. There is no clear second chapter. This suggests intentional stopping. The killer chose to end his activity. That choice implies control, and control implies satisfaction or resolution. Perhaps the killer achieved whatever internal objective drove him. Perhaps the risk grew too high. Perhaps Ness's crackdown disrupted his routine enough to make continuation inconvenient rather than impossible. This distinction matters, because inconvenience does not equal justice. The absence of violence does not equal safety. It simply means the behavior changed. Another possibility is often overlooked. The killer aged out. As people grow older, physical endurance declines. Strength fades. Dexterity weakens. What once felt manageable becomes exhausting. A killer dependent on physical precision might recognize his limitations and stop before mistakes exposed him. This is not remorse. It is self-preservation. The Cleveland torso murderer showed consistent self-preservation throughout his crimes. He avoided attention. He adapted methods. He removed identifying features. He watched investigators closely. Stopping would be the final adaptation. The most unsettling aspect of the case is not that the killer escaped capture. It is that he likely lived out his life peacefully. He may have died decades later, known to his neighbors as a quiet man. He may have attended church, held a job, shared meals. The people around him may have sensed nothing unusual. This is not speculation born of imagination. It is a pattern observed repeatedly in similar cases. Violence, when compartmentalized, does not always consume its author. Sometimes it ends and leaves no trace. The city of Cleveland gradually moved on. New crimes replaced old fears. Generations grew up unaware of Kingsbury Run's past. The torso murders became a footnote, a curiosity for historians, not an open wound. But unresolved cases do not heal. They fade, and fading is not the same as closure. The killer's disappearance forced investigators and citizens alike to confront an uncomfortable truth. Justice is not inevitable. Some crimes remain unanswered not because they are unsolvable, but because they are allowed to become irrelevant. When the murders stopped, the urgency stopped with them. That may have been the killer's final victory. He did not need to escape handcuffs. He only needed to outlast attention. And he did. Modern profiling and theories. Decades after the last body was found, the Cleveland torso murders remain one of the most analyzed unsolved cases in American history. Not because of what is known, but because of what is missing. Modern criminology approaches the case very differently than investigators in the 1930s. Today, serial murder is understood as a behavioral phenomenon shaped by psychology, opportunity, and environment. Patterns are not just physical, they are cognitive. When modern profilers examine the Cleveland torso murders, they see a killer who does not fit the popular archetype of chaos or insanity. They see discipline. The offender displayed high levels of self-control. He avoided impulsive escalation. He selected victims strategically. He adapted his methods based on investigative pressure. And most importantly, he stopped when continuation no longer served him. This places the killer firmly in the category of an organized offender. Organized offenders plan. They control environments. They anticipate law enforcement responses. They are often socially functional, sometimes respected. They compartmentalize violence rather than being consumed by it. This profile immediately eliminates many early suspects. It also reframes the entire investigation. The Cleveland torso murderer was not driven by explosive rage. He was not intoxicated during the crimes. He was not acting out of desperation or psychosis in the traditional sense. His violence was purposeful. That purpose remains the central mystery. Some modern theorists believe the murders were motivated by a desire for absolute control rather than sexual gratification or emotional release. The removal of heads, destruction of identity, and careful disposal all point toward domination, not spectacle. The killer did not need recognition, he needed erasure. This distinguishes him from later serial killers who sought notoriety. He did not write letters. He did not taunt police publicly. He did not want to be known. He wanted to be untouchable. Another theory suggests experimentation, not scientific experimentation, but experiential. Testing boundaries, testing methods, testing how far he could go without consequence. The progression in skill supports this view. But experimentation alone does not explain why he stopped. Which brings modern analysis back to one recurring name: the physician. Modern profilers do not claim certainty, but they acknowledge probability. The suspected doctor fits multiple criteria: anatomical knowledge, access to private facilities, social respectability, and a documented decline in mental stability around the time the murders ended. Institutionalization would explain the sudden cessation, the absence of further crimes, and the lack of public resolution. Critically, it would also explain why the case became quietly buried. Exposing such a truth would not simply have solved a murder case. It would have shattered trust in medicine, law enforcement, and civic leadership at a moment when public confidence was already fragile. Institutions often choose survival over truth. Another modern angle examines opportunity geography. Geographic profiling suggests the killer operated within a comfort zone that included Kingsbury Run, medical facilities, and transportation routes. The spatial distribution of bodies forms a rough radius rather than random dispersion. This supports the idea of a local offender with stable residence and predictable movement patterns. Not a drifter. Not an outsider. One of the most compelling modern insights involves the killer's relationship with law enforcement attention. He did not flee immediately when pressure increased. He adjusted. He waited. He observed. This indicates emotional detachment rather than fear. When Eliot Ness conducted raids and public crackdowns, the killer did not panic. He paused. That pause suggests the killer had alternatives: places to hide, routines to change, identities to maintain. He was not cornered. He was deciding. From a modern psychological standpoint, this suggests the killer viewed the murders as a chapter, not a compulsion that defined his existence. Once the cost outweighed the internal reward, he stopped. This is rare, and it is deeply unsettling, because it implies that some people can commit extreme violence, then return to ordinary life without collapse. No dramatic ending. No breakdown. Just silence. Modern DNA technology has offered no resolution. The evidence is gone. The bodies were buried decades ago. Samples were not preserved. Names remain missing. The case exists now only as history and as warning. The Cleveland torso murders demonstrate how a killer can exploit social invisibility, institutional fear, and investigative limitations. They show that intelligence without empathy can be more dangerous than madness. They remind us that not all monsters announce themselves. Some simply stop and walk away. The legacy of fear. The Cleveland torso murders did not end with an arrest. They ended with absence, no courtroom, no verdict, no moment where truth replaced speculation. Just a gradual fading of attention, until the case became history instead of emergency. And that, more than anything else, is the killer's final mark. Because when violence ends without explanation, it does not disappear. It settles. It becomes part of a city's psychological architecture, something felt but rarely spoken about. Cleveland never truly answered what happened in Kingsbury Run. Instead, it buried the question beneath redevelopment, highways, and time. The shanty towns were cleared. The ravine was reshaped. The physical environment that enabled the murders was erased. But erasure is not resolution. The torso murders exposed something that America in the 1930s was not prepared to confront: that a person could commit repeated acts of extreme violence without madness, without spectacle, and without consequence. The idea was unsettling. It contradicted comforting narratives. The killer was not a monster hiding in shadows. He was likely educated, controlled, possibly respected. He did not collapse under pressure. He did not crave attention. He simply stopped. That reality challenged the belief that evil always reveals itself. It doesn't. Sometimes it blends in. The victims, meanwhile, were never reclaimed. Most remain unidentified to this day. No names were restored. No families received answers. Their lives ended twice, once by violence and once by forgetting. That forgetting was systemic. It reflected whose lives were valued and whose were not. In this sense, the Cleveland torso murders were not just the work of a killer. They were the result of a social ecosystem that allowed certain people to vanish without consequence. Poverty, transience, and invisibility were not incidental to the crimes. They were essential. Modern true crime often focuses on killers, their psychology, their methods, their mystique. But the lasting lesson of this case lies elsewhere. It lies in how institutions respond when truth threatens stability. Cleveland chose order over transparency, silence over accountability, comfort over certainty. Those choices did not create the killer, but they protected him. The torso murders influenced future investigations in ways that are rarely acknowledged. They exposed the need for centralized databases, consistent forensic practices, and psychological profiling. They demonstrated the danger of fragmented jurisdictions and political interference in quiet ways. They helped shape modern criminology. But the cost was high. A man likely lived out his life unchallenged. Victims remained unnamed, and a city learned that some questions are easier to bury than answer. Today, the Cleveland torso murderer exists mostly in archives, documentaries, and whispered fascination. But fascination misses the point. This case is not frightening because it is mysterious. It is frightening because it is plausible. Plausible that someone could do this and stop. Plausible that systems could fail and move on. Plausible that truth could be lost not through destruction, but through neglect. The killer did not need to escape. He only needed to wait. And in the end, time did the rest.